Just want to welcome you here. It's a very good endeavor you have, outstanding endeavor, bringing together a lot of people. And hopefully you're going to bring about a lot of change too. So I think with refugees, it's a major aspect of what Canada is really good at. And maybe we've slipped a little bit. And maybe it's time to go back to where we have been and maybe discover some new approaches to take with refugees. It seems like a very serious problem. Nevertheless, I'm here to bring greetings from Martin Singer, our dean. He couldn't make it today. He just returned from China and India, where we're actually looking for recruiting students. We're quite interested in making York much more international. We want to just change the complexion of our student body a little bit and make it a little more global. So I think what you're doing here ties in very closely with what my faculty, the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, wants to do in the future. So I welcome you very much. I hope you have a very good time here. If you have any concerns about York, can't find your way around, let me know. I know the campus quite well. And I did work for Alberta Social Services. I have a daughter who works for the federal government. I'm a very big believer in non-government organizations, and I want to see a lot more change going on. And I think this is the place to do it, and maybe this is the group that's going to bring about a lot of change. What do you say, Mike? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, and have a very good day.
Well, good morning. Nice to see so many people who were here yesterday back again. It said something about the product, I guess, that we're selling. And for any newcomers who've just arrived, you are really most welcome. Just a reminder, the conference is being videoed. And if you have objections to having your picture taken, please let the organizers know so we can put a big black X over your face when we show the video with you on it. I would like to just recap a little bit what we experienced yesterday. I can't recall a conference, and I say this very modestly, I can't recall a conference that went on so long where nobody lost interest in what was going on, where everything that was being said was absolutely riveting. I mean, I was absolutely exhausted by the end of the day. And it was not because of that it was hard work, it was because there was not a moment when you could let your attention wander. And I think we're going to see the same thing today. And if we do it on the third day, I think we're probably going to have to ask the Associate Dean to send in medical counseling for us all, because we'll all be kind of burned out. In any event, just a recap of yesterday. We had a quick look, a very fast tour of the evolution of Canadian refugee policy. We heard the most moving, gripping, first-hand testimony from four families, four people who made the terrible decision to leave their countries and heard about what was involved in that, the suffering and the loss and the life in the camps and the excitement of learning that they were going to be coming to Canada, although in many cases they only had the vaguest notion what Canada was. And we heard about the shock of getting off a charter plane from somewhere deep in Southeast Asia into minus 40-degree temperature in Montreal, and how that sort of brought home the fact they were moving somewhere different. We heard also what it was like to be an international or Canadian official out there at the front end, moving from camp to camp, and interviewing and preparing the people for movement to Canada. And the astonishing accomplishments of about 20 young Canadians who between them moved 60,000 people over a period of about 18 months. A stellar accomplishment. In the evening last night, we had the most wonderful presentation by Mr. Udo Jans of the UN High Commission for Refugees New York office. And I must say, I was just absolutely taken with his starting his story as a young man, starting out with the UNHCR and being on the beaches of Indonesia, trying to protect the people on the boats, and how he wove his own personal experience with the 20 or more years of developments that went on as the Indochinese movement went on and on and on, and the international efforts that came together at the end to sort of manage it down while protecting the institution of asylum. And then he took us on a tour of the challenges today, and the importance of the whole notion of burden sharing between countries and between peoples that has somehow been lost to a large extent in our contemporary world. And he wondered why or whether we couldn't use the inspiration of what was done not only in Canada, but with about 60 other participating countries in those days when the world responded to the plight of the boat people and the other refugees from Indochina. Well, today we shift our focus from Asia to Canada. We'll consider the role of the media in alerting Canadians to the refugee tragedy. We will hear from a series of political, religious, and official and civil society leaders working at different levels to challenge the concern of Canadians into the possibilities opened by the new refugee sponsorship system. And we will hear of the experience of first encounters between refugees and their sponsors. At noon, we'll have the real pleasure of hearing from one of Canada's brightest new novelists, Dr. Vincent Lam, whose novels, his first novel, The Headmaster's Wager, caused such a stir, and it's really a fascinating example of how the refugee experience actually helps create Canadian culture. Amazing, eh, to think about that. And then tonight, we will have Canada's first senator of Vietnamese origin address us during the dinner, and talking about the transition from refugee to engaged citizen. So we're in for another engaging day. Now, moving on to the program. In 1975, and again in that period from 78 to 80, Canadians learned about the plight of the refugees in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos through the media. In many cases, they learned about the fact that they could do something about it through the newly minted refugee sponsorship program through the media. Our opening panel will examine the media's role at that time, and perhaps cast some light on its role in informing people about the many tragedies that are afflicting our contemporary world. I'm honored to introduce our chair, though in truth she needs no introduction. Alison Smith is the host of CBC Radio's flagship news program, The World at 6, and is the senior correspondent for CBC News. She was born in Osoyoos, BC, and since my daughter lives in Oliver, BC, I claim kinship with you. You know, they're all related out there, eh? Whether they know it or not. Somebody once told me about Oliver that Father's Day was the most confusing day of the year. Ms. Smith began her journalism career in Toronto, covering municipal and provincial politics. In the early 80s, she moved to CBC TV's The National, where she covered national news and business news. She became the news host at the launch of CBC News World in '89, anchoring and reporting on the major stories of the day in Canada and around the globe. Before her assuming her position in The World at 6, in the fall of 2009, she was the Washington correspondent for CBC Television. She spent 4 years traveling through the United States, where she covered, among other things, the historic election of President Obama, Barack Obama. So I turn it over to you, Alison.
Thank you. Good morning. It's not often that my history in Osoyoos follows me here. As journalists, we often glibly say that we're writing the first draft of history. And particularly on a day like today, which of course is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of JFK, I couldn't help but think that it's not it's only on those sort of big days like that we look back at some of the coverage from that time. It is actually, in fact, very rare that as journalists we stop and consider for a brief period of time the influence or significance of that first draft that we often write under great pressure of deadline and without much thought, really, of the sort of longer-term significance or influence. I think this is also an important discussion to have at a time when relations between media and government are strained, to say the least. And that's evidence, I think, at Toronto City Hall particularly, which has been in the news, but also particularly for some time in Ottawa as well. So I'm looking forward to this reflection, and it's a real pleasure for me to reconnect with the two journalists who are here. So let me introduce them to you first. Peter Murphy and I actually shared a newsroom together for a brief period of time, and I can't remember how many years ago that was, Peter. He's an award-winning television reporter and anchor for both CBC and CTV. Much of his time, where you probably recognize him from, was as a senior national correspondent and anchor for CTV National News. He's also covered conflicts around the globe, notably the Falklands War and various conflicts in the Middle East as well. And I would say conflicts, political and otherwise, here at home, too. Peter Goodspeed, we were sort of joking this morning, I think probably the last time we might have seen each other was at Toronto City Hall. He's an award-winning foreign correspondent and reporter for 4 decades. He has reported from 63 different countries, covered 22 different conflicts. He's currently the Atkinson Fellow in Public Policy, and he's investigating the refugee experience in Canada within the context of the country's asylum determination procedures and the increasing international migration to this country. And Howard Edelman is probably known to all of you. He's the founder of Operation Lifeline, Canada's largest civil society response in the Indochinese Refugee movement. He also established the Centre for Refugee Studies at York University. He's been a visiting fellow at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, a visiting professor at the Woodrow Wilson School, also at Princeton, and he was also a research professor at the Key Centre for Law, Ethics, Governance, and Justice at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. This morning, I'm going to ask each of them to speak for about 10 minutes. I know from your remarks this morning that this is an engaged audience, so I'm counting on you after that to generate the discussion, because I'm sure you will have questions. So, Peter is going to begin. Which Peter?
Thank you, Alison. Good morning, everyone. And I want to thank James Simeon and Mike Malloy for organizing this conference. When James Simeon asked me to come here and speak, he didn't know my total repertorial experiences. He said, "You were in the media, you could talk about this issue." And I said, "Well, actually, I reported in Hong Kong in 1979." And I said, "You know, I'll just go and get some of my stories at CTV and I'll play them and that'll be it." And of course, months later, I go to CTV to get the stories, and they were on film. We shot film in Hong Kong, and CTV didn't keep them. But they did keep some W5 piece, and I'm going to show that in a couple of minutes. I think I have to cue it up. So in the last week of July of 1979, the temperatures in Hong Kong hovered in the 90s. The humidity was about the same. And Super Typhoon Hope was just forming out over in the Pacific and about to bear down on Hong Kong. As a newly minted network correspondent, I'd only been at CTV for 10 months. I arrived in Hong Kong as part of a growing Canadian contingent of reporters who were covering what we call the boat people stories. I was accompanied by producer Eric Morrison. We picked up a local freelance crew, and CTV also had sent a W5 crew. David Ritchie told me that he, in fact, accompanied them to Pulau Bidong. I'm going to show you a clip now. In fact, the day after they had been on Pulau Bidong. Keith Morrison was the reporter. He's now with NBC Dateline out of Los Angeles. And I'm just going to play this clip. I haven't edited it.
This is boat KG-2463A. It is rotting now in the warm, clinging waters of the South China Sea. Early in May, 611 people, men, women, and children, sick and frightened, stumbled off this boat onto the beach here at Camanan on the east coast of Malaysia. 7 days and nights of misery, thirst, piracy, rape had finally ended. The exhausted people tumbled from the boat, kissed the sand, lay down here. A few hours later, screams pierced the still Malay night. The local people say the women were being raped again, this time by Malays, probably soldiers. Brutality toward the boat people is common in Malaysia, and it has been encouraged by a government fearful of racial imbalance, of regional instability, and of a deadly tide of communism it thinks could wash over Southeast Asia. 10,000 boat people are camped along Malaysia's coast, but since the government has refused to allow any more into its camps, these 300 face brutal rejection. The authorities don't want witnesses, especially CTV and producer John Scully.
We're from Canadian television.
I don't care. You are from where?
From Canada?
I'm not allow you to take photo of you.
Why not? We're on.
This is not the place.
No, we were.
If you want, you go to Providong.
Now let me just tell you. Can I speak? We were on Palabidong yesterday. Yeah.
I tell you. I know. I understand. I understand your station. But this is not the place.
Why not? Why can't, if we're allowed to...
I received the orders that nobody are allowed to interview or to do anything down here.
The Vietnamese had been camped on the beach for 3 weeks. Now, with their few meager belongings, they were told they were being moved. Then, in groups of 50, they were herded onto a bus. Shuttling back and forth, the bus would eventually take all of them to a point 3 miles down the road. Again, the Malaysians were determined not to have their actions filmed. Now, hidden from the threatening Malaysian soldiers, we saw the buses had unloaded the refugees at a dock near the town of Dungun. And we were about to see Malaysia's brutal policy being put into effect. 4 small fishing boats had been brought alongside. Enough food for about 3 days was loaded. Then 6 soldiers ordered the Vietnamese to board. Whether these boat people had been told of what was about to happen to them, we don't know. But relief officials report that generally the Malaysians tell the so-called illegal Vietnamese they're being moved to an island refugee camp. It is a trick to win the cooperation of the refugees, who are then forced out to sea, usually in the direction of Indonesia. With a Malaysian Marine on each boat, the tiny craft plunged into the rough sea. Far offshore, naval vessels waited to take the Marines off and force the boats and their stunned, anguished cargo on to further misery. Maybe they'd be picked up by a mercy ship. Probably they'd be attacked again by pirates, the women raped again. Perhaps 50 or so refugees would die. So far, 20,000 boat people have left Malaysia like this.
That's part of an hour documentary by W5. They shot it in the end of July and the beginning of August, ran in the beginning of September. There is a clip, maybe I could run it later, there's a lot of narrative and Cold War rhetoric involved in this, and it's interesting, the context of it. Anyway, much has been made of the role of the media as a factor that contributed to the favorable conditions that resulted in Canada's acceptance of boat people. I'm a retired reporter, not an academic who's researched this issue, but from my personal experience and faulty memory, my impression is that through 1977, 78, and the early part of 1979, much of the coverage in the Canadian media was provided by international news services. Certainly, that was the case of CTV. Star reporter Gerald Utting was on the scene. CBC used to have a bureau in Hong Kong, and I think they might have closed it in '78, but I'm sure that they provided on-the-spot reporting. In a paper for this conference titled On the Genesis of Operation Lifeline, Professor Howard Edelman says that in a review of Canadian newspaper media stories from January to May of 1979, he found two stories, one on the Vietnamese boat people, one on Canada's relationship to Vietnam. During the first 6 months of 1979, UNHCR says it accepted over 200,000 Vietnamese boat people. Professor Edelman states that by the end of June 79, the Canadian media was providing extensive coverage of fleeing refugees. Indeed, that was my experience as well. One of the reasons, though, that the Canadian media may have been focused somewhere else was the federal election. In May 22nd, 1979, we had a federal election. It was an upset. Pierre Trudeau lost to Joe Clark, and it was a conservative minority government. According to Professor Edelman, a Gallup poll in February of 1979 found a majority of Canadians agreed that accepting 5,000 Vietnamese refugees was too high. In that first part of 79, on February 3rd, while the Canadian media was largely silent, the American media were reporting on it, and the New York Times carried a piece called Hell Isle by Leo Chern, the chairman of the International Rescue Committee. It described the plight of the 30,000 refugees on Pulau Bidong, and David Ritchie had been there and described it very dramatically yesterday as well. By late 79, July, when I boarded a plane for Hong Kong, the front pages of the Toronto newspapers were filled with boat people's stories. We had a layover in Vancouver. I rushed off the plane to grab the copies of the two Vancouver newspapers and was surprised to find not one story on Vietnamese boat people. So the intensity of the coverage across the country was not uniform. This apparent lack of interest was soon to be outdone when we had another layover in Narita Airport in Tokyo. The news there we got on our waiting for our flight into Hong Kong was that Japan had accepted 4 Vietnamese refugees and were going to pay for 200 to be resettled somewhere else. What triggered CTV to send a reporter to the scene was a hastily devised plan by the new Conservative government to fulfill its increased obligation to take 50,000 boat people. It had organized 11 flights from Southeast Asia to Canada, and the first flight was from Hong Kong to Edmonton. We arrived at Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport, the site of one of several refugee camps. The camp was located, as I can best remember, in an old airplane hangar crammed with people. The refugees slept on metal bunks, 3 and 4 high. What struck me the most on my first visit to the camp was the orderly and peaceful nature of very anxious yet hopeful refugees. Outside the building, made of corrugated iron, we filmed a long line of refugees, families, small children, young men, waiting to be interviewed by Canadian visa officer Scott Mullen. He sat behind a 5-foot, 6-foot wooden desk, a translator on his side, some papers in front of him. He had sandy-colored, receding hair, and I assumed he was an experienced visa officer in his early 30s. I was surprised to find out that he was 22 years old and only 1 year out of McGill University. While I don't have the benefit of the interview I did with him, CTV didn't keep any of the stories I did. Luckily, the CBC did, and they put it up on the website. And in an interview, I think with Peter Mansbridge, Mullins says, "It's a gut reaction. You look at the person, do you believe that this man who spoke fluent English, was he an auto mechanic in Vietnam, or was he something else?" You have to go on the reaction to the individual, and whether or not you can believe that the information they're giving you is reasonably true, and most of the time it is true, reasonably true. Mullen continues, "If they have the strength and courage to leave home, survive 2 months at sea, 2 months in the camps here, they will adapt. All the refugee movements we have had, be they Hungarians, Czech, Ugandan Asians, I think we have to look at it ourselves. They've done well in the long term, and this we have to look at as an investment in our future." For the refugees, Mullen was judge and jury with tremendous power over their lives and future. He sat there and, using a government set of criteria, made what for the refugees was seemingly a life or death decision. If the refugees spoke English or French or had a skill or a trade, it would guarantee them almost automatic acceptance to Canada. Luckily for the refugees, Mullen was a benevolent, sympathetic decision maker. My impression then, and it still remains over 30 years later, was that he was biased in favor of the refugees and that his biases reflected those of the government and the bureaucracy. This is not a criticism of Mullen or the government, but an observation in my opinion. I believe that Mullen had an almost impossible job, facing hourly moral dilemmas. I believe that he did a heroic job, and that Canada, as we heard yesterday from the other visa officers, did an amazing job, and that we owe them a debt of gratitude. Was this bias, the bias of Mullen and those of the Canadian government, the result of media stories and the public pressure generated by those stories? I don't think so. Some observers say the tide of Canadian public opinion was turned in the autumn of 1978. Canadian media coverage, and CTV I know did cover this extensively using international sources, ABC, CBS, and NBC. We had access to all of those. In October and November of 1978, the refugee boat, the Hai Hong, where Malaysia denied entry to 2,500 refugees, is credited by some for turning the tide of public opinion in favor of upping the number of Vietnamese boat people Canada would accept. By June of '79, after the Canadian media jumped on the bandwagon of Boat People's story, the government upped its intake of refugees to 12,000. And then on July 18th, just before the Geneva conference on this crisis, they upped the number again to 50,000 and had announced previously their one-to-one matching formula. The extensive media coverage allowed the government to dramatically increase its response to this massive exodus, despite the fact that only a minority of Canadians in public opinion polls, about 37% according to Professor Edelman, supported the idea of an increased intake. In a democracy like Canada, the Canadian media can play a crucial role in informing and swaying public opinion. They do that not just by the stories they cover, but often more importantly by the stories they don't cover. As they do it in a context of the times, swayed by business and commercial interests and influenced by government policies. The media is a commercial enterprise. They sell a product, and inherent in what they do is a realization that they can attempt to influence public opinion, but a knowledge that they can't get too far ahead of their readers or their viewers. There's also a realization, or at least there used to be, that they have a moral obligation to cover stories that are uncomfortable and unpopular. The Canadian media may have been slow to cover the exodus of Boat People's stories in 1979, but once committed, they became fully engaged. Thank you.
You'll be able to read my paper, it'll be posted, so I'll just speak to it. I'm not a journalist, I'm an academic, and some people could say I sometimes did journalism. Part of the creation of the Center for Refugee Studies, between when it was the Refugee Documentation Project on Indochinese refugees, was the expansion of it by doing what was primitive journalism. The two stories in particular made our name. One, we went to Lebanon after the Israeli invasion, and there had been two different competing versions of how many refugees had been made homeless. One was the Israeli story that 20,000 had been made homeless, and one was a full-page ad of Oxfam Britain that 600,000 had been made homeless. And we thought there was a slight discrepancy. And that we had read and done a lot of work by then, that we believed that in conflict situations, you could establish objective facts. And so we went over to count the homeless. Long story of how we got in and what happened, but we didn't have to do a count because 12 counts had already been done by the Israelis, by Palestinians, by engineers, city municipal engineers, all kinds of accounts. And all of them, given their perspectives, were reasonably accurate on the ground. And where there were differences, we could reconcile those differences. And we published those figures, and they began to be used internationally. And we made our name for beginning to establish objectivity in facts. A second case was in Sri Lanka, when Canada was getting refugee claims from Sri Lanka from the north. We had a policy that people who were affected by the riots in Colombo got refugee status. But we were hearing stories of Tamils from the north who were claiming they were being persecuted by the army and they fled, and telling their stories, and they were being rejected as refugees. But we interviewed a large number, 6 people, and we thought the stories were similar, but they were credible. But we weren't sure. We didn't know. We were naive. And we managed to get not only to Sri Lanka, but in spite of the ban on any overseas people going north, we got into the north. And that's a separate story of how we did it. And found, in fact, the train we were riding on, the tracks got blown up in front of us, and we were in the middle of a full-scale war, which was not being reported at all. We spent 3 weeks gathering data and finally got arrested by the army. I got out with the story, flew to Tokyo, to the Toronto Star Bureau, actually, who printed over the Saturday and the Sunday edition, two full pages on Saturday and 2 full pages on Sunday of the data we fed in that had been rewritten by the bureau chief because my journalism wasn't the best. Because it's a form of storytelling and creating a story, and he was much more effective than I was at it. Within a couple of weeks, though I got the byline, by the way, even though I didn't write the story. Within a couple of weeks, the policy changed in Canada. And you saw a direct correlation between a media story and a policy decision because people didn't know about it. It helped that I went to the Canadian Embassy in Colombo and briefed them before we left for Tokyo, and that helped. So I had a bit of a media experience. But my first experience was really with the Indochinese refugees. And before I get to that, I want to do another retrospective, which was the study we did for the Rwanda genocide in 1995. We spent a year on this. And there are parallels, because there are 2 issues at stake in the coverage. One part of the coverage is the internal coverage, what was happening in Rwanda that caused the genocide. And one of the things we discovered was there were 3,500 reporters in South Africa covering the end of apartheid. And 2 of those reporters happened to stop. Nothing happened. There was no big story in South Africa. If you recall, everybody's expecting a civil war and terrible thing. Nothing much happened. They did it well. And when they did it well, the reporters are all disappointed. 2 of the reporters, one from The Guardian, happened to say, well, I hear there's a story going on in Rwanda. The genocide is underway. And they stop in Rwanda, in Kigali, and begin reporting on it. If they hadn't stopped, it would have been a different phenomenon. So you have to pay attention not only to what the media cover, but what they don't cover. And when you don't know the inside story, and we didn't know the inside story, it was never well covered on Indochina. The stories of the war with China, between Vietnam and China, between Vietnam and Cambodia, the ethnic cleansing of the Chinese, these, if you read through the press at the period, they're not well covered at all. There's some mention of the big story sometime in China, but virtually it's not covered. So all the refugees come as if a shock comes. Nobody knows the backstory because there's not enough depth of coverage. Now, in the case of the Rwanda genocide coverage, we had experts on media, scholars on media, particularly Steve Livingston from Georgetown University, who was a professor of media studies. And he was part of the team who covered the media coverage. We also had, there was extensive coverage from Belgium, particularly on the media, and particularly Radio Mille Collines, that really did an analysis of how radio was used to foster the genocide. And here you have to differentiate between the kind of media and among the kind of media. When I reviewed the media, the fact is I reviewed the print media. It's just, I'm a print guy. It's my bias. It's not the truth, though. The fact is, by then, as it's been mentioned earlier, the main impression on people, on the public, and on parliamentarians comes through the TV, not through print media. This was true by '79, and that's why you had Vietnam as the first media war, where TV and imagery and changed the particular situation. And that was the case. And so you have to know both the internal and the external. Now, in the case of the Rwanda genocide, if you count the numbers of dead, whether you use Alison DeForge's under 600,000, or you use Kagame's figure of 1.2 million, or you use what the figure most of us use is 800,000 killed, it's a large number. But in the Rwanda exodus, there were up to 400,000 killed. The numbers aren't so incompatible. And if you say, how much coverage was there relative to what was happening? Well, you find at one point it's very heavy, May, June, July. And Peter mentioned earlier that, in fact, CTV wasn't really onto it in May and June. That was a period in which total blank for me, because I didn't encounter, as you'll hear in the next panel, I didn't hit the media until the third week in June. I was up in my island, and I was totally oblivious to what was going on in Southeast Asia. So it's what you hear, and unlike Alison, I don't have the view that journalists are the first level of historians. My son is a professor of history at Princeton, and we've had discussions of this, and I believe they're the first level of myth-making. Now, it's myth-making supposedly rooted in fact, but in partial fact. But I don't underplay myth-making. It's critical. It's very important. It builds a structure of understanding a narrative story. And building that story can be done in different ways. And if you do the internal story of the Indochinese and you listen to the refugees yesterday, it's a story of terrible tragedy. But, you know, the way Peter just told the story and the way it's eventually played primarily in Canada is as a heroic story, the heroism of Canadians in saving the refugees. Not in the heroism of the refugees leaving, which is a whole heroism in itself, or their tragedy, but it's our heroism, what we did for them. Now, it's a certain kind of structure of a story which reinforces a pride, reinforces wanting to do anything, and that mythology and constructing that myth is very important. And the way the story begins is, as sort of covered already, is I give it 8 chapters. It's like a novel, and it begins with the end of the Vietnam War. And the coverage at the end of the Vietnam War is essentially, it's America's problem. Those bad guys did the war. They're the losers of the war. The warriors there came back as psychological cripples. They weren't heroes. Aren't we glad we stayed out of it? So we're taking very great pride that it's not our deal. We say, okay, we'll take some refugees. Mike mentioned we take 2,500, then another year similar amount. And so we take maybe 4,000, 4,500, and we've satisfied our neighbors' desires to get us involved, but we haven't assumed any real responsibility. You watch the way I was a scholar in Australia, and you watch the way the Australian media played it. They felt they had a responsibility, but they resented the responsibility, very different than the Americans. And they were worried and over again, especially the Whitlam government, that there were going to be an invasion from Southeast Asia of flotillas. And at one point there's a bunch of boats come, about 40. They say it's 600 boats. They say it's 20,000 when it's just 400 people, but it's a lot. They see this invasion, and they're afraid of the yellow peril, and it's the government that's afraid of the yellow peril. It's not the National Citizens Coalition. So you have the story played in different ways in different contexts by different government leaders. We play it one way, and we do our quiet bit, but it is the main story. We're not heroes in the story. We're just accommodating the Americans. Mike told you yesterday that it begins to change in the civil servant's mind in 77, 78. They begin to understand it's a different story. It's a story of what North Vietnam's doing. It's a story of ethnic cleansing. It's a story of the fight with Kampuchea and China. It's a bigger context. The public doesn't know a bit about this. By and large, totally ignorant. And so they're preparing the ground, and we don't know a thing about it. The Hai Hong does make a difference, and it's played off first as these rich Chinese with gold bricks. That's the main story. You read through the old thing, that's the main story, which says, why do we take these rich guys? They're not really rich refugees. So that's the image you get. That's the myth being created, and your resistance is not to do much. So Bud Cullen's doing it. He's taking 600 instead of 200. But the public, why should the public be involved? Now, there's a sales job the civil servants do, and they go around, they finally get the Mennonites and the Christian Reformed Church on side, and I interviewed people from the Mennonite both years ago and this week, and they tell the story. They easily were sold. To them, people are refugees fleeing, and they have such an intense memory from the 20s of their own flights from Russia, their own persecution, and it is bred deep into the culture, and their desire, as well as being Christians who believe in witnessing, to do something for refugees. So they're an easy sale once you tell them the story. And the civil servants told them the story, the same with the Christian Reformed Church. So they could do it quietly, but you couldn't get a mass movement that way. And the mass movement required the coverage that happened in May, June, which I was oblivious to. As I said, I was away from it all and wasn't in touch with the media at all. There's virtually no coverage after the Hai Hong, so it dies down. That coverage intensifies. There then begins a growing passion. And the story is told radically different. It's now a difference of really the plight of the people. They're drowning, they're being raped, etc. It's a story of valiant Canadians then rising up and volunteering, with the initial ATKI proposal of the 8,000 and 4,000 from the private sector. So that gets coverage, and what's not being covered is really the really popular opinion, which isn't very sympathetic to it. Why nobody's covering that, other than that when the National Citizens Coalition gets involved, is another story, because it doesn't fit in with the story of heroism of Canadians, etc., of our multiculturalism, etc. There's a silent censoring goes on. It goes and censors bad things. It goes and censors good things. One of the things they did censor repeatedly, because I was in the media repeatedly at the time because of Operation Lifeline, and one of the stories they censored was a story I repeatedly told and kept track of telling, including to the CBC when I was on CBC, and they never included it in the story. And the story was that Operation Lifeline was not our doing. It was by accident. The civil servants showed up on a Sunday afternoon, as I'll tell you in the next session, and suggested it to us. We said, oh, well, we were going to put pressure on, write a letter to Ron and say, Ron, you ought to do more. Why aren't you doing more? And I was going to go back to the cottage. And they said, why don't you sponsor some refugees and do a bit of witnessing and do something instead of just writing a letter? You know, it wasn't a bad idea. It helped that there were some ministers and a couple rabbis at the meeting because they were much more into witnessing than perhaps some of us were. And we thought it was a good idea, and we did it. It happened to get named Operation Lifeline by accident, as you'll hear. And how it got going, it wasn't our idea. I would tell this story to the media, and never once, and I kept track, there were 168 cases of my telling that story, and not once was it reported. Because it didn't fit in with the mythology that the government only responds to public pressure. And so you have a story still in the CBC. If you read the CBC archives of the Indochinese refugee movement, it's the government responded to public pressure, not to public support, that it was waiting and eager for the support, but they were pressured into doing what they did. Now, when you do any scholarship, you know they weren't pressured into doing what they did. They wanted to do it, and they needed support to do it. Very different story. But that isn't the story that was told. But without the story that was told, it would have never happened. The media were critical, and they told a heroic story as well as a tragic one and wove them into this dramatic tale that fostered the whole refugee sponsorship movement. One of the interesting things is it wasn't just in the elite press. As Ron noted when we talked the other day, The Sun, which is, you know, the Sunshine Girl, and it's this kind of press, and it had enormous coverage of this foreign news story, not known for its foreign news. City TV, Moses Neimer, a City TV known then for its blue movies on Friday evenings, made its fame that way. Moses couldn't get me on the phone, comes to my house where we had the original Operation Lifeline, says, come down to City News. You got 3 minutes every night on City TV, talk about the refugees, talk about the sponsorship, get the people going. And so for weeks we had 3 minutes of free publicity on the media. It was widespread coverage. Now, I've talked already about how the backlash was handled when Ron kindly fed me that question. So I won't repeat that, because there's also the problem of what you get suppressed. And it was important to suppress for the refugees themselves and how they adapted, for the sponsorship. You're in a political fight here. It isn't just about news. To keep your story primary and not the story that the majority of Canadians don't want these people. It's a terrible story. It's a terrible story about your country. It's a terrible story about identity. But the fact is, the elites all wanted it. Every single professional organization had endorsed it in public meetings. Big business. I told you the story yesterday. It was big, wealthy businessmen who stopped the National Citizens Coalition, not us. So keeping the story going in a certain way. And of course, then the story gets a matter of fumbling. I've told the story that the reneging on the story of the reneging on the matching formula wasn't really a story of reneging. The Clark government was a good humanistic government, whether you agree with fiscal policy or not, but it was also a fumbling government. Sorry, Ron. It fumbled in a number of cases. One of the cases we talked about was, of course, on the Jerusalem embassy issue, which became a big issue, which was a fumble. The way it was handled was the problem. The same was the case with the way the matching formula was handled, because the civil service had prepared a case to say diplomatically, we're going to help the private sponsors. There's so many of them. We'll let them go to the head of the line. So instead of saying that and saving the government sponsorship for the next fiscal year, which was the plan, Flora, who was a good-hearted woman of anybody can say anything about it, she just bled for the refugees, no question. She had gone into the Cambodian pledging conference with an authorization to spend $5 million. She hears all the stories about the genocide, and she pledges $15 million. And so the finance minister says, well, it's coming out of your budget. You got $10 million to find. Who has the money? It's immigration. So it comes out of immigration. And so you have these kinds of little struggles, that go on that lead to kind of mistakes in rhetoric and communication. But the refugee support community saw it as a reneging deal. The media saw it as a reneging deal, instead of as an awkward handling of how to communicate a problem. And so you have the dilemma of, it isn't history at the time. It isn't even basic history, because the facts aren't all there. There isn't the sorting and an analysis of the fact to create a correct narrative. But the myth-making is there, and the myth-making is critical. And when the myth is there, in this case of a heroic myth, widely adopted, celebrated, it worked, and the media is to be congratulated for it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be invited to join your panel today, but from the outset, I must admit that I personally have no experience in covering the Indochina refugee crisis of 1975 to 1980. I'd like to think that's because I'm much, much, much too young, but I was just a junior reporter at the time. Still, I thought I might start today by talking to you about my first personal exposure to the boat people. It was in June 1989. And I was returning home from covering the aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre in China, and I got to spend a few days in Hong Kong, where I had a chance to visit a small, rocky, previously uninhabited island of Tai Chau, just southeast of Hong Kong's main islands. At the time, Tai Chau was crammed to bursting with about 5,000 asylum seekers who were living in makeshift tents and abandoned buildings, and there were another 1,000 people who were left on board leaking fishing boats in the tiny harbor, all under armed guard. There were no proper sanitation facilities on the island. There's virtually no shelter from the blistering sun. And the only water available was brought in twice a day by the Hong Kong police in plastic bottles. The people in Tai Chau were safe, but they were also weary and resigned. Many had just spent 2 months at sea, where they'd weathered typhoons, evaded pirates, endured sickness, and suffered hunger. Like the tens of thousands who had come before them in the period we're discussing at this conference, most had fled Vietnam, searching for a better life. But for most of the people in Tai Chau, that journey was in vain. Nearly 90% of the Vietnamese asylum seekers who arrived in Hong Kong when I was there would be declared illegal migrants. They were condemned to spend years living in despair and deprivation in overcrowded detention centers, former army barracks, abandoned factories, floating barges, or out-of-service ferries. In the late 80s and early 90s, Hong Kong's boat people camps had a reputation for squalid hopelessness and sporadic violence. The refugees slept and lived in three-tier bunks in cage-like compounds. Robbery, physical and sexual abuse were rampant. Gangs divided between people from North and South Vietnam ruled the camps, and they regularly fought over food and cigarettes. There was constant tension, threats of riots and hunger strikes. Life for the boat people of '89 was very different from the experience of those who had fled Southeast Asia a decade earlier. The asylum seekers of '89 encountered a world that had no room or patience for them. It was as if compassion had been overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the needy. In 1975 to '88, Indochinese refugees were almost automatically resettled. But after '88, they had to undergo a screening process based on the 1951 United Nations Refugee Convention, which is the basis of Canada's own refugee determinant procedure. But after 1988, Vietnamese asylum seekers could only qualify as refugees if they proved they fled their country because of political or religious persecution. If they left simply because they didn't like communism or because they wanted to improve their standard of living, they were categorized as illegal immigrants and kept indefinitely in detention camps until they could be convinced to go back home. Under that refugee determination system, fewer than 10% of the asylum seekers who arrived in Hong Kong after 1988 qualified as refugees. The drama and the pathos of 1989 and 1990 was really not all that different from 1975 or 1979. Yet the outcomes were incredibly different. In the 5 years I reported on Hong Kong's boat people camps, I was always amazed at the stark historical difference. Whenever I'd tour the Hong Kong detention centers, people would thrust notes at me, pleading for help, asking me to get in touch with a family who had already been resettled in the West, in Australia, the United States, France, Britain, or Canada. Some of their letters were accompanied by photographs of other Vietnamese families, refugees from a decade earlier, who were enjoying their new lives in their new countries, posing for a family picture in front of a new car, or in a new house, or in front of a Christmas tree. So what changed between 1980 and 1989? For one thing, I think there was a dramatic shift in the type of asylum seeker arriving in Hong Kong from Vietnam. The later waves of boat people came mainly from northern Vietnam, and they were more easily identified as economic migrants rather than political refugees who were fleeing persecution. But the one big difference was that the world had moved on. History had left the later wave of asylum seekers behind. In 1975, the end of the Vietnam War produced a crisis of conscience in many people, even in Canada. We hadn't participated in the war, but we did witness it daily in our living rooms on television. In the late 1970s, Southeast Asia seemed to be unraveling under a horrific combination of new wars, Cambodia's killing fields, and the vindictive policies of conquering communist ideologues who produced 1 million refugees. People in the West, who had watched the Vietnam War from a safe distance over a decade, feared genocide and felt an obligation to make a humanitarian reparations. I think the crisis also offered people a form of reconciliation for anti-war and anti-communist elements. We buried some of our past differences by caring for the victims of the war. Media coverage in the Indochinese exodus was intense, and it was powered by vivid descriptions and dramatic film clips. It was a huge news story that drew attention of readers and viewers. We were, after all, dealing with the largest refugee crisis in the world since the Second World War. And I think the media and the Canadian people, like most armies, have a penchant for fighting the last war. Before 1975 and 1980, comparisons were constantly made between the plight of the Indochinese refugees and the victims of the Holocaust. Pol Pot's death camps conjured nightmares of Nazi concentration camps, and the sight of rusty freighters crammed with frightened refugees triggered guilty memories of the MS St. Louis and Canada's shameful failure to give nearly 1,000 Jewish people sanctuary in 1939. That said, I think there's no doubt that the media coverage of the initial exodus from Southeast Asia had a huge impact on Canadian perceptions of the crisis. But I don't think we in the media can take that much credit for that. I think Canada was already primed to act the way we did. Our credibility as an emergent, confident middle power almost required the sort of response we saw. Canadians viewed the world and ourselves differently then. I think today we miss that independence streak with its confident, assertive idealism that we took so much pride in back in the decade or so after Canada's centennial. I think that change, in part, is the explanation of the problem Mike and Howard discussed yesterday when they talked about the emergence of a distinctly different culture in our civil service and our civil society. But the change between now and then runs even deeper. When I started reading in on this period from 75 to 80, I was struck by the important role that churches, religious leaders, and community groups played in resettling refugees. Sadly, I think everybody would agree that all those groups have much less clout now. Canada is increasingly more secular, and our people are more isolated, insular, and self-indulgent. Finally, as location is everything in the real estate business, timing is essential for every good news story. In 1979, the timing for the boat people story couldn't have been better because it drew our attention away from more mundane problems. During April and May, we'd endured a federal election, and just as the news of the Conservative government was taking power, the exodus from Indochina soared to 50,000 people a month. So the drama on the high seas was a welcome change of pace in the news business for editors and readers and viewers alike. It was also the first major crisis faced by a new government at a turning point in Canadian history, so it got massive attention. As far as the media was concerned, it was one heck of a story. It has all the elements that are needed to grab the attention of our audiences. I think it's important to note that there were nearly 500,000 refugees from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam who escaped overland to Thailand. But it was the plight of the boat people that touched everybody's hearts. And subsequent surveys showed that Canadians overwhelmingly wanted to help refugees who had been stranded on the high seas. Now, the media's infatuation with the boat people, like our current infatuation with the disastrous career of Toronto's mayor, was an intense, self-perpetuating news event. I think news spreads like waves in a pond. Once a topic gains a certain level of attention, it attracts more attention, and that in itself makes it more newsworthy. And there are feedback loops that expand as the story spreads. A reporter starts with a specific incident. He moves to reporting comparable incidents, reinterprets incidents in the past in light of today's experience, digs deeper into the background of current events, and then starts reporting on society's reactions to the previous news wave. But like waves in a pond, that story cycle eventually dies out, and so-called media fatigue sets in, and the readers, the viewers, and the editors all move on to focus onto something else. In the past, this sort of thing used to take a considerable amount of time. But today in the media, given the influence of the internet, our attention span seems to be considerably shorter, and events go viral for much shorter periods of time. As a result, chronic emergencies like civil wars and famines, or complex emergencies that are difficult to understand or describe, are too frequently regarded by readers, viewers, and editors alike as neither immediate nor spectacular enough to deserve extensive coverage. An example springs to mind, which I've had some experience with, and it's the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's easily the deadliest conflict in the world since the Second World War, and it's estimated that up to 5 million people have died there since 1998. I went to Eastern Congo 3 times as a reporter between 1998 and 2001, but the conflict never really captured the attention of Canadian audiences. And to try and get people interested in other crises like the disaster in Darfur is akin to pulling teeth. By contrast, the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 caused around 200,000 deaths, and it received more news coverage in a period of a couple of weeks than the crisis in Congo ever did. There's a reason for that. The DRC conflict is complex, it's convoluted, and it's confusing. Whereas the Asian tsunami has a gut-wrenching story at its core with universal appeal. A huge wave of death killed thousands, tore children from their parents' arms, devastated countries, and ruined people's vacations. Like 1975 to 1980, the Indochinese crisis, the tsunami story also offered Canadian audiences a chance to participate in its resolution. The only response to a disaster like that, similar to the current crisis in the Philippines, is to rescue and rebuild. As a result, the response to the Canadian public becomes a story in itself. Interestingly, that response, like the refugee resettlement program of 1979, was spurred on by matching commitment by the Canadian government. When led properly and challenged to be heroic, Canadians respond magnificently. In the original boat people crisis, the thousands of asylum seekers who fled Southeast Asia had nowhere else to turn. They were rejected by neighboring countries, towed out to sea, ignored by passing ships. Canadians watching the story, as presented to them in the media, felt compelled to offer a solution, the only solution that looked reasonable, to resettle people here. I think it's interesting that Canadians haven't come to the same sort of conclusion in a crisis like Syria's civil war. We're 2.5 years into a crisis that's created more than 2 million refugees and terribly destabilized the Middle East. Canada's probably resettled fewer than 100 people to date, though we have promised to resettle 2,000 in total by 2015. It's a dramatically different response, and I don't think a lack of media coverage plays a role there. Media coverage is only a part of the equation when it comes to explaining something as dramatic as the Canadian response to the Indochinese crisis. There has to be a predisposition by the people to help. There must be a leadership by government, and there must be an obvious workable solution to which people feel they can contribute. In Syria's case, the crisis is complicated. Unfortunately, Canadians aren't paying much attention to it. There's no readily apparent solution, and our government seems lost in trying to understand how things may play out. As a result, they've been unable or unwilling to offer much leadership. Like the boat people, of the latter crisis in the 1990s, Syria's refugees may remain warehoused in regional camps until the situation resolves itself. For them, and for us, the only bright ray of hope may be to continually remind ourselves that Canadians have played a crucial humanitarian role in the past, and we may yet do so again. Thanks.
So they don't have to jump up and down. Thank you all very much. So I want to open up the floor to all of you now to see, because I'm sure you want to engage in some conversation with them. I can see you getting to your feet, so I'm going to reserve my questions and let you begin.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Is this on?
It's all right, we can hear you. Yep.
Thank you so much for the presentations. They were really, really interesting. I have two very quick questions, which may in fact require long answers. The first is there were a number of mentions of stories not being told, and I'd be very curious to hear from the journalists who are on the ground about any stories that you wanted to tell that you weren't able to for whatever reason. The other question I have is about the role of, I'm going to say race in terms of how you were telling the story about either the camps in Hong Kong or the boat people in 75 and 80. And I asked the question because the first refugees from Asia came to Canada in 1962, and it was under the Diefenbaker government, and they were very worried about how Canadians would receive refugees from Hong Kong. And so they spent a lot of time working with journalists to make sure that the right message was going to get out. They were worried about integration, they were worried about racist pushback, and I wondered whether that factored into your thinking as you were covering stories, whether race was something that you were concerned about mitigating or addressing, whether you were careful about the language that you used, those kinds of issues. So if you could comment on those two questions, that would be great. Thanks.
Who wants to start?
Well, I didn't feel, I was only in Hong Kong for a week to 10 days. I didn't feel that we were pressured. Race was not an issue. In fact, I made some comments about being biased. I think that journalists were also very biased in covering this story in favor of Canada doing something. Certainly that was my personal. I think that over 40 years as a reporter, I have my own biases, we all do, and I tried to be fair. But in that case, the story just told itself. And it had a personal impact on me. As soon as I got back, my wife and I joined a group, and we sponsored 4 young men. We were living in the beaches. The one looking at this W5 piece, the narrative and myth making, to understand it, to make it understandable to the reporters, John Scully and Keith Morrison, there was they described this crisis as the Soviet Union, as Vietnam being a client state of the Soviet Union. They did an interview with Malcolm Fraser, the Prime Minister of Australia, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Malaysia, the Foreign Minister of Malaysia, and they all described it as Russia forcing Vietnam to do this and to destabilizing the East, the Southeast Asia, and they said 1 million more refugees to come out after 500,000 had come out. And I don't, they obviously got it wrong. They didn't understand the history, they didn't understand the times, they didn't understand what had gone on in the Diem regime with Chinese, ethnic Chinese in Vietnam. Anyway, I didn't feel we were forced, and race was not an issue. In my subsequent reporting experience in the Middle East, in Lebanon, I spent a lot of time in Palestinian refugee camps covering hand-to-hand combat, and in the last year I was in Dadaab, the largest refugee camp in the world. 500,000 people in the middle of a semi-arid desert on the Somali border in Kenya, and the world is accepting 4,500 refugees, and a handful of them get to come to Canada, 25, 45 because of WUSC, and several of them are here at York University, but they're stuck there, and there's no way out. And they're in effect in a jail, but I'm going on too long.
I can't think of a specific example where there's a story I had that I wanted to get out. Interesting thing since the 75 to 80 period is a lot of governments try to manage the news and control it. I think a real good example now, currently, is Australia, where they've taken refugees, boat people, put them in islands offshore, and refused to tell anybody how many people are coming or what they're doing. They've had press conferences where they just say it's a military operation, we can't give you details. That kind of management of information now is far more common than it was, I think, back then. And that's the one thing you do encounter on trying to get the stories.
You also, I think, in your remarks too, Peter, you referenced sort of the complexity of the stories. The difficulty of telling a story that's complex often makes it hard to sell to editors. And it also occurred to me, and I realized just listening to Professor Edelman when you were talking about not being able to get that story told about, you know, it was the government's idea, and Mr. Atke would appreciate this. Frankly, if the media would have looked at you as self-deprecating guy who'd done this fabulous thing separating Operation Lifeline, who are you to say that it was the government's idea? And frankly, if the government had stood up and said it was our idea, we'd have just said it was self-serving. You know, nobody would have believed it. Anyway, I digress.
That actually reminds me of a comment that Robert Andrus said to me when I took him to the Chinese embassy to sign the book of condolence for Chairman Mao. He was slumped in the corner of his car. When I got there, he had just come from cabinet. I can't remember the horror of the day, but it was a horror. And I said, you know, rough day, Minister, and he said, yes, we considered at the cabinet meeting controls on the media, but we do that at every cabinet meeting. I wanted to comment on your observation about the moral dilemma that Scott Mullen faced when he, just a year out of McGill University and at a tender age, was required to make these life and death decisions. Sometimes not life and death, but the difference between blighting a life and changing a destiny, perhaps. Now, Scott was, of course, an extraordinary Foreign Service officer. We recognize that. We, his seniors, recognized that from the very beginning. And so, you know, we were not surprised at how well he performed. We signed on to make those difficult decisions. We were trained to make those difficult decisions. There were much worse moral dilemmas than that we faced in those refugee camps, and I think the worst one was what the Americans inflicted upon us when they made a decision that in order to be considered for resettlement in the United States, you had first of all to be refused by Canada and Australia. And in a place like Pulau Bedong, that meant that we wasted hours and hours and hours interviewing people who dared not tell us they wanted to be refused because we were required to write that on the UNHCR registration card, requested refusal of resettlement in Canada, which the Americans would then use to deny them entry forever to the United States. If we rejected them, they might break down in tears in front of us. We had ruined their lives. So what would we to do then? Accept someone who didn't want to come to Canada, force them to come to Canada, or leave everything off the UNHCR registry card? If we had written, we offered them resettlement in Canada and they rejected it, again, the Americans would exclude them forever from resettlement in the United States. So that was a much tougher one than deciding whether or not they could be resettled in Canada. And when the officers I supervised in camps would ask me what to do about that, I just said, let your conscience be your guide. We can't make a policy on for Canada and what we're going to do about that. We just have to decide if we're going to pretend it never happened. And the problem with that, writing nothing on the card, was that we'd interview them again at some point in the future when we were going through cards for people to be interviewed we hadn't seen before. So it does get worse.
First of all, thanks for the 3 presentations. Really very gripping. We're off to a wonderful start. We're working on a book on this to try and tell the story from the perspective of those of us who were in the government at the time. And I've been thinking for the last several months about what to compare this with, this remarkable period, particularly the 79-80 period. What else has ever happened in our living memories that caused such a complex reaction in Canada, where all levels of government and vast numbers of our citizens, despite the naysayers, really actually, they didn't send a check. They actually took somebody into their homes. I mean, this was a pretty substantial commitment to accept strangers from someplace you'd never heard of. Are there analogies in our history? I mean, aside from, say, fighting the Second World War, where everybody put their shoulders to the wheel, even the wars we fought since then have not required that everybody or such large numbers of Canadians sort of personally get involved in sort of a huge national undertaking. And I've been thinking about, reactions to the famines in Ethiopia, the World Fairs, Expo 67. I mean, can you think of things that reverberated through our society in that way and caused such that we could say, okay, this is like something?
I can think of one, not like, but that has parallels. We took in approximately 200,000 American refugees. We didn't call them refugees. They were draft dodgers and deserters and people who migrated. And we didn't call them that because we weren't going to take on the American power next to us.
But do you think it had the
It did.
The broad public?
We were running the end of the Underground Railway in Toronto before the draft dodgers and deserters were admitted legally. Draft dodgers we easily got through. Deserters took a lot more trouble in campaigning with the government to allow the deserters to come in. And because at first they were being illegally housed, etc. So there was a big movement, but it wasn't at all the same. It wasn't a public movement. It was a quiet movement. It was one which the government played a permissive role rather than an active role. It didn't require financial thing because they were Americans and could easily be self-supporting, and they came up as students and families, etc. But there was a response, and it was part of the similar stream of Canada beginning to enunciate its own character and differentiation from the Americans, taking pride in more humanitarian things and being a less militant country, far less militant country. So there were some parallels, though it's not the same at all, because it didn't have those dimensions, but it was in fact a larger movement.
I would say the Second World War, as you said. During the war, there were the children who came over from Britain, went into Canadian homes. This was a moral crusade, and I think that there was some of that in responding to the Vietnamese boat people. Now, it was bigger, and we had soldiers, and we spent a lot of money, but that was the only time I can think of. I mean, we had the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Ugandan Asians, but totally different. But the government played a role, and the government is playing a role today, and we're not involved in Syria, accepting more Syrians. Why not? Why not having more people from the Dadaab refugee camp?
I also, this doesn't speak to the parallels, but I wanted to pick up on something you said, Peter, about the time. I mean, I think in some ways it was, we talked about the television war and the fact that, you know, a decade earlier, for the first time, people had war in their living rooms. And this was the first crisis of this nature where the faces of those refugees were actually in people's living rooms as well. You know, you heard their stories told. And now, in fact, I think as journalists, you know, there is a bit of a gloss over factor, right? We have, yes, those stories coming from Dadaab, the stories coming from Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, and there's, it sounds cruel, but it's almost like there's a sameness to the story, and every editor on the other end of the phone says, well, how are you going to make the story different today?
Thank you.
Just one point, when the Ugandan nations came, I don't know if this happened everywhere, but many came into Toronto, and people were asked to bill it. Refugees coming in on planes every day, and for example, I was a very young person working in the government at the time, and I said I had a one-bedroom apartment, I said I'll take either a single woman or a couple, and I was sent a day later 2 single women, 1 Muslim, 1 Hindu, who said they never would have spoken to each other in Kampala, but anyway, so there was, most of the people, I think, coming into Toronto were billeted for the first month or two on a day's notice by Torontonians.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your kind invitation. So we're talking about Vietnamese refugee. Today I would like to present to you some Vietnamese refugees who had an eyewitness. And we're talking about something about the grown-up media. So the first people I would like to introduce you, Mr. Thang Hoang, the president of the elderly Vietnamese of Toronto. He was a recipient of the Professor Howard Elderman, 2007. Yeah. And the second delegate is Professor Peter Chan. Yeah. He's the advisor of the elderly Vietnamese in Toronto. He is a former working in the Welcome House of Ontario. He is the partner and witness on the Telethon television night, 25th August.
Thank you very much.
So, Madam Alison, because our team is talking about the role of media, right? So, I would like to quote very short paragraph from His Eminence Aloysius Ambrosic on the night of 26 August 1981. His Eminence at the day is the Archbishop of Toronto at the St. Cecilia Church, our church. Yeah, he considered a big matter, a solemn matter in order to thank you, Canada. Merci, Canada. In thank you to thank the Godfather. So now I would like to quote short paragraph, His Eminence talking about the role of media, and I think that's good one. Ladies and gentlemen, the Vietnamese refugee and especially Vietnamese Canadian Catholic, from the bottom of our heart, we are very much deeply appreciate all of the public and mass media of Canada and related party. May I have a bravo, please?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Because by the hardworking and very much diligence of the mass media from Canadian Public Corporation and all people of the world, they do understood, they know how the flight, the tragedy, the despair, and the melancholy of the Vietnamese refugee. By the realized capital, and competency, the mass media of Canada came directly go to refugee camp and report about the deeply hardship, difficulty, melancholy, and tragedy, and little dangerous when the Vietnamese both people and all the refugees have faced. Because of this, the mass media ignite the compassion and the generosity of the Canadian who always living in the bottom of heart of Canadian people became the ignite again and make a big difference. That is from the homily of His Eminent Aloysius Ambrose. And on behalf of my fellow people, Vietnamese refugees, please accept our deep appreciation with Madam Alison Peter McQueen, all of your fellow worker. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Professor Peter have something about later on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Punan Somun Khan, a Salvation Army officer from Hamilton. Just before I ask the one question that I have, I just want to give the credit for the media of the pictures of the misery of the boat people. Even though at that time there were influx of the refugees from Laos and Cambodia, which is never mentioned at all when I heard about your essay or whatever you memorized of the past of the refugee influx from the Vietnam conflict. The question I want to ask is this. Were the media aware at all of those who are in the same situation from Laos and Cambodia? Which is, you heard the story yesterday. Some of them walked for 22 days. Somebody walked many days and losing membership of the family because of the hardship of the traveling. Some have faced the Thai authority and returned them back and forth. At the same time, the Lao refugee from the north to the south, in 1975, the influx that made the people leave the country because the Lao communists start to take the people away from home. Anyone that they thought it was their enemy or who worked with the government that against them before, they start to select and they will start to disappear during the night. So that is the influx of those refugees. So when I saw your clip, I have not seen any clip that reported from those people who left the country. But I thank God, even though our picture, we don't mean to be on TV, but we want to know if you are aware of those influx of refugees at all.
This program that I showed you a clip from was an hour long, and in fact they did go through refugee camps that had mostly Laotian and Cambodian refugees, and Keith Morrison described it as the forgotten refugees of Southeast Asia. They did report on it, but you're quite right. The media eyes were all on the boat people, and of course it was easy to get to Hong Kong, so there was lots of reporters. When I was in Hong Kong, I saw 2 or 3 Toronto Star reporters. Dale Brazio was there, a two-way guy, and Gerald Dudding was there, I know of for sure. But you're right, it was the forgotten, and Keith Morrison talked about that in that one, so I don't know about other reporting, but he described it as the forgotten refugees of Southeast Asia.
Thank you. The microphone over on the side here.
Okay. I'm a former immigration officer from way back. I wasn't involved in the Indochinese movement at all, but I do have a question. The treatment of refugees by the Canadian public in the late 70s versus the late 1930s is totally different. Do you think that this was influenced by the way that the public learned about issues through the media, or is it just different historical period?
Can I answer that?
Sure.
The answer is clearly yes. I'll give my own personal story. When I was returning from going down from the island after not hearing all the stories in May and June, till I came down the end of the 3rd week in June, I was going to run a peace exercise at Grindstone Island for the Quakers between Palestinians and Jews, and I was carrying with me a review article of 3 books on the treatment of Jewish refugees from the 30s by America, by Britain, and by Canada. And it had a powerful impact on me. That's why I said I had to do something. Ron Atke can tell you himself personally, he had read a draft of Harold Troper and Irv Abella's book on None is Too Many, when the policy was to keep out refugees, and said to his administrative staff, I'm not going to go down in history that way. So that was percolating in the air, certainly by people in the know, and it percolated out into the public, I think, and had an enormous influence.
The media in the late 30s was very small, owned by individual families. And the narrative was anti-communism, it was racist, it was anti-Semitic, and so it's not surprising that they turned back the St. Louis in 1938.
But the public in Canada was still against the Vietnamese movement. If you go by the polls,
Yeah.
52% throughout the period.
But there was a big enough group of people in Canada that were moved. You know, it's a complex society, and you only need a small portion of people to elect Rob Ford, and you only need a small group of people. 30-some% is a huge number who will
Elect a government.
well, yeah, who will elect a government and who will decide that they wanted to respond. But there, there's a context with they were being led by a government and by a bureaucracy that was supporting this. I mean, if the bureaucracy was against accepting Vietnamese boat people and the government was against it, it never would have happened. But there had to be all these decisions with people in the bureaucracy, and then there had to be ministers like Ron Atke and Flora MacDonald who had a sense of history and a sense of justice and a moral rectitude. They said we have to do something, and we don't have that leadership today.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. My name is Shauna Labman. I'm a law professor at the University of Manitoba. And my question, I have two interrelated questions, one about the role of media and one about the state of refugees from the Indochinese to now. And so my question is, at the time of the Indochinese, the original flows, Canada was not a country of asylum, a first asylum. And so you had the resettlement side, but not the asylum side. And I'm curious about how that changes media coverage when now you have refugees claiming asylum in Canada, as well as the resettlement. And tied to that, you actually have, and this has sort of been touched on, a much more active government, I would say, myth-making and messaging about who those refugees are on both the resettlement and asylum side. And in terms of the media, there's also in terms of the government proposing its own sort of media campaign, NGOs then actively proposing their own counter campaigns, and the media itself now not being journalist media and print media and television, but also blogs and different Twitter, everything. There's so much more breadth in who's covering and how the coverage is happening, and how, as reporters who have been doing this throughout that entire period, do you reconcile all those different circumstances now?
Sort of what I'm working on my fellowship this year, and I really don't know the answer. I think right now there's a lot of people, there's a separation between asylum seekers and resettlement, and it's almost seen as separate silos, but the images that are created in one have an impact on the other. But that's about all I can say right now. I've still got a year's worth of work before I can make up my mind.
Peter, did you want to comment?
No.
I was going to say, I'm still, obviously working in the media, and I think too what you have to think about is how people consume news. I mean, you referenced that in your question, but the way people consumed information in the 1970s and early 80s is very different from the way that people consume news now, and they can be just as influenced by American coverage or British coverage or coverage from overseas as they are by how we tell the story in the Canadian media. We'd like to think they pay attention to Canadian media first, but I'm not necessarily sure that that's true. The other piece, and this goes back to an earlier question about sort of parallels and whether we would see something like this again, I think 9/11 changed people's perspectives on the world all over the globe. And I think when Peter raised the question about Syria, I mean, that's at the back of everybody's mind. You know, you can look at 2 million refugees in Jordan and Lebanon and all of that, but 9/11 is still playing in people's minds, and they're afraid of you know, who's on that plane.
You know, one thing we haven't really talked much about this morning is just how the media has really changed since then. When the period we're talking about now, 79, 80, CNN started a 24-hour news network in 1980, early 1980. It changed the way we were doing business there, but with the internet now, I mean, it's drastic. Competition for information, the impact that simple blogs and people's opinion have over just factual news has changed the way we're all perceiving.
And it makes it much more difficult to tell complex stories because news comes in smaller bites. So the simple idea, the myth making, the simple narrative is a story that has much more, I would say, power and influence. Go ahead, Peter.
And it's more difficult to control public opinion. So what happens now, and I've been reading some stuff lately, is that people go to the news sources that they trust or feel confident in. So in the States, they go to Rush Limbaugh or Jon Stewart or Fox News, and they don't go to anything else.
Yeah, they're looking for...
And so they're just looking to...
validate their own opinion in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Go ahead. This will be the last question because I know you need to move on.
Derek Dean, Citizenship and Immigration. I'm not sure whether it's so much questions as observations based on what's been said today, but in terms of the magnitude of our response at that time, you know, Peter, you mentioned that this came after sustained media coverage of the Vietnam War, and I think that might have sustained a sense of responsibility on the part of the West that we need to do something. But tied to that as well, I think might have been the fact that, well, maybe not the fact, but the belief that maybe we could solve the problem, you know, or do at least something significant. Because when you counterpoint that against, as you said, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the conflict there, and the conflict in Syria, there might be a feeling we can't do anything but put our finger in the dike. And then you also spoke about the institutional bias or the bias within the government at the time, the bias within the department towards refugees. Well, the legacy of 911 is also maybe a bias against, but a suspicion of refugees and where they're coming from. And to overcome that within the public consciousness is a very difficult thing to do.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yes, of course.
Just make ask one question in terms of the media and what is not covered. I know the remnants of the Vietnam War is still happening in Southeast Asia, and I just wanted to say that in 2007, so I'm Stephanie Stobie, I teach conflict resolution studies at Menno Simons College at the University of Winnipeg. So I was doing research in Laos in 2007. And after I finished conducting my research, we were actually prevented from traveling across the country. So the airplanes were closed, the Mekong River Passage was closed, the roads were closed, and this was a consequence of what was happening in the United States with General Vang Pao. And he was apparently arrested in the United States for trying to buy weapons and to move it across Thailand to go into Laos so that they would bomb the Lao government buildings and officials. And so he was arrested at this time in the United States, and so we were prevented from traveling. And so when finally, after a few days, we were able to travel again, we wanted to go visit my grandparents who lived just up the river. And again, there were curfews and there were fighting in the towns where we were staying, as well as in my grandparents' town. And when we came back home, I asked my colleagues at the university, did you hear anything about what was happening in Southeast Asia? Did you hear about Vang Pao being arrested and what was happening in Laos? And no one heard anything. And I looked on the internet, and at the beginning, I found just very few articles on it, and then after that, it all disappeared. So, the remnants of the Vietnam War is still happening in different parts of the world, and so I'm wondering, why didn't the media cover that story?
The Vietnam War?
Yeah, the story of Veng Pao being arrested.
why
and,
did they
and-
not? I see.
And what was happening in Laos.
Right.
I think you find right now that most major media are barely existing. The internet has changed the way we do business, and it doesn't change the way we collect news, but it has affected the bottom line. And all the newspapers I know of are laying people off and cutting back on bureaus. I spent a couple of years as a foreign editor at the Toronto Star. At the time, we had 7 bureaus. They now have 1 in Washington. So it's really, they still do foreign coverage. They'll send people out and do a lot of stories, but just the way we're covering the world now has changed drastically. And you find it right across the board. Baltimore Sun used to have about 24 foreign news bureaus, and I don't think they have any now.
Chicago Tribune the same.
Yeah.
I would meet them all over the world.
Yeah.
Not anymore. Thank you all very much for your insight and for your contributions as well. I find it really inspiring, actually, to think about a time of overwhelming compassion when our compassion was not overwhelmed, of bold leadership in government, and I also hope that you leave with some notion that there is some truth in myth-making.